So today I'd like to return to my reading or elaboration, perhaps, or use, strategic use and deployment, if one likes, of Robert Duncan's poem, "Often I Am Permitted to Return to a Meadow." And I like the idea of returning to a place that one is permitted to return to, though in fact I'm not returning to the place the made place that Robert Duncan is permitted to return, but rather I'm permitting myself to return to the memory of the permitted place that Duncan was allowed to return to. And this, after, in a certain sense, I have posed or poised this question of permittedness and refusal. And eventually, we'll get to a point where we interrogate this understanding of first permission and the way that that might play out within this pastoral tradition and this and this other tradition. This other tradition that is perhaps older than the pastoral tradition, but out of which the pastoral tradition certainly grows. And I'm referring to the mythos of an Edenic originality, from which humankind is fallen, and whether the course of that fall is a matter of destiny or a matter of knowledge, a matter of the movement, right, from a domain of innocence to a domain of experience, or whether it's seen as the inevitable loss of the permissions of childhood and the acceptance, the adult acceptance and responsibility of interdiction and restraint. Are questions we can play out in the future, and I want to get there. And then what I wanted to do, prior to that, is address the question of that we can find, a question that we can find, within this sentence. It is only a dream of the grass blowing east against the source of the sun, in an hour before the sun's going down, whose secret we see in a children's game of ring a round of roses told. And I eventually want to get to the point where we can question and attempt to answer what the secret in this game is, and how the secret within this innocent child's game of a ring around of roses might be another way of playing out, the movement from this pastoral domain of, or perhaps, in this instance, the pastoral verse is attempt, to reacquire that Edenic space of childhood innocence or freedom within this realm of knowledge, but that this space of liminal and perhaps regressive, right, play, fosters a kind of gentle, comforting permissiveness that is seen, I think, both as, in an interesting way, both as a space of childhood, and therefore a space of subjectivity prior, right, to what we understand to be, adult subjectivity. And yet, this space is, as it is often portrayed in pastoral poetry, a space of eros, right, and amour and love, and certainly, Duncan is aware of this space as being erotic in discussions of the flowers that are flames, and these flames are lit to the lady, and certainly what is merely hinted at, and often I am permitted to return to a meadow, is made much more, explicit in other places in Duncan's poetry. I'm thinking of passage, 18, where the relationship to the pastoral tradition becomes part of the figural representation of the description of the body of the lover, right? And so relates to this tradition of the pastoral space as an erotic space, and the wooing of the lover, and either the rejection or return of that love, in terms of the landscape itself, right? So that passage begins, most beautiful, the red flowering eucalyptus, the madrone, the yew is he, right? And then that takes us to, at least it takes me to the Song of Psalms, as Song of Songs, as well as that whole bucolic tradition, right? And then the next passage from that passage relates, back to this Edenic space that one can, perhaps, given given the opportunity of mind and imagination, move toward, even in the exile of this. And I don't know if his reference to London and exiled eyes is a reference to Blake, but it might be. But even in this exile of this domain of squalid, impoverished, restricted living, right? That this imaginary space of the sensual meadow can be returned to, right? So thou wouldst smile, and the smile, I think, is significant in terms of both what we've been doing with smiles and laughter, and the various references someone like Blake makes to smiles. So thou wouldst smile, and take me in thine arms. The sight of London to my exiled eyes is as Elysium, note the reference to Elysium, to a new come soul, right? And then elsewhere, again, making references to this landscape as the body of the lover. At the rise of the pectoral muscles, the nipples for the breasts are like sleeping fountains of feeling in man, waiting above the heat of his heart, shielding the rise and fall of his breath to be awakened, and there are references to paradise and all of this, right? So it's certainly much more explicit in the torso piece, but it's there as allusion mostly in Off I Am Permitted, and just like there are these elements of what could be considered references to pagan magic and beings of light are there as subtle allusions, and And I want to get to those illusions in what might be what Duncan is referencing as the secret of a ring of roses. But before I do that, and today I want to focus on something else in this return, which is and it really relates, more to what I make of it, and to my turning this peaceful meadow into a place of howling winds. And I want to do that because a very close reader of my work pointed out in a space-time travel communication coordinate message that this pointing out was also questioning, but noted that and I guess wondered, how and why did I transform, this the space of this meadow into, a reference to Shakespeare's King Lear and the scene on the heath and the howling storm. Who's there beside foul weather, one-minded like the weather most unquietly. And then, noted in this particular space-time travel communication a couple of other things that many, many years ago that I made a reference to King Lear and this particular storm, and I did it in a kind of what's disguised as an essay concerning Artaud and John Clare, and I made reference to the relationship between Lear and his fool, and I described the whisperings of the fool as having this force of potential force of revelation that can't be spoken. What can't be spoken in any other way can be spoken in the whisperings of the fool, and I related this to. In various ways, I related this idea of what lurks within language and its secret whisperings as belonging to this broad domain of what sometimes is referred to as nonsense, but that I attempted to argue that is perhaps elusively and calculatedly deceptive, right? Elusively and calculatedly deceptive means of truth-telling, what cannot be told. And I likened this, to the force of the lightning and the thunder on the heath. And I said, Lear's fool accompanies him through the storm on the heath. All third acts reside in such storms. So someone, had pointed this out, and particularly the howling, and wanted to know in this recent piece that I did, which is called "What a Letter Means to Be Unopened at the Fold," in which I make I transform Duncan's idea of field and meadow into this place of howling, storms and concrete. If I was in some way returning, to these ideas in this essay, and obviously the answer is yes. And then there was a further question, which I thought was interesting, and obviously the answers are all yes, but. Someone had pointed out that recent deployments of various kinds of howling. The howling of the wind in this piece, what a letter means to be unopened at the fold, and the howling of the hedgehog, masquerading as a fox, and lip syncing to Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, this section of what I had referred to humorously as beast language. All of these howlings also seem to relate to Howl, right? The famous poem by Allen Ginsberg. And so the question was, and it was really implied by the space-time travel communication coordinate more than it was specified by the space-time travel communication coordinate. But what I inferred by all of these subtle and oblique forms of communication was that there was a question, and that question was, well, how does the howling wind referenced that is a reference itself, to the storm on the heath in Lear, and the howling, right, which is a deployment and in some ways a parody of Michael McClure's growling lions, roaring lions. How does that howling of the hedgehog and the howling wind on the storm relate to Howl by Allen Ginsberg, and how are you using that reference to talk about what Robert Duncan does in Often I Am Permitted to Return to a Meadow? And I can begin answering that question with citing a particular passage from the Duncan, and that passage is the final sentence of the poem, and I'll quote that. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow. All right, now think about this meadow as this Edenic space, right? Pre-fall, in a certain sense, fall of humankind, in which things are allowed, but the ramifications of experience are not yet available to consciousness, right? So it's this Edenic space, and one is permitted, to say traverse, from the realm of experience back into the return to the realm of innocence, right? As if it were a given property of the mind. In other words, as if by rite of passage or growth of experience, or for whatever reason, that it's not a domain that is lost to consciousness, but it is a given property of the mind, right? A domain that within that because that one possesses this space or place as property, topos, that one can return to and is permitted to return to in a way that adulthood isn't permitted to transgress that rite of passage maintained or accomplished, right? And therefore established as a kind of boundary line. And often I am permitted to return to a meadow as if it were, and of course it isn't, a given property of the mind that certain bounds hold against chaos. Now, there's a way of reading this, certain bounds hold against chaos. There's a way of reading this as almost, from a Freudian perspective, that, if we were permitted, to return to this space of libidinal pleasures and plenitude and the childhood, id, then those boundaries, right, that the ego and the superego hold us, against, would be violated, and there would be nothing holding back chaos, right? But I want to, turn that idea, and then I'm not really going to address this last line, because I want to, this last part of the line, I want to address that later. That is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is. But I want to address this idea of chaos. Okay, so returning to this, if one imagines it, from a Freudian perspective, right, as or even Jungian, because in Jung, the id and the shadow, right, have a lot in common, and if there were no bounds to hold us, perhaps, and restrict us, and if everything were permitted, as that William Burroughs often quotes, this figure, right? Nothing is real, everything is permitted. And if everything were permitted, perhaps in that sense, that might represent chaos. But what I want to do is turn that idea and make this more about the and I think there's justification within the poem itself to do this. To look at this idea of the meadow as almost a place in which the mind rejuvenates itself, right, against all the restrictions and condemnations, and the way that in a certain sense, both society and the superego spend a lot of time, torturing us into obeying, right, certain kinds of restrictions and rules, and certainly as a homosexual man, Robert Duncan would have felt this in an extraordinarily painful manner, right? So that that part of him that was, I won't say most essential, but certainly essential. One of the most essential parts of him was something that wasn't allowed by this this property of denial and refusal and rejection and suppression, right, and oppression as well, and there are violent consequences of this ideology of suppression and oppression. And so this meadow, this pastoral place, this field, like opens the possibilities of this almost like dreamlike REM, rapid eye movement space of allowing, those parts of being that are restricted, this freedom, and what I want to suggest in this word, chaos, is that that without such a meadow, right, to return to, that without this space, this field, this opening, that what is repressed and what is denied, and this is somewhat like a Freudian reading, returns, and it returns in the form of this darkness, right? This chaos, or these shadows, and we certainly know that this is in fact an experience that we have as desiring subjects under conditions of repression and oppression, and it seems to me, and now I'll turn to Howl and my references to the howling wind and what I make of those first few passages of Ginsberg. that he's in fact, describing those best minds of his generation that he refers to as destroyed by madness and starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. And we could certainly address this phrase, the Negro streets, and what it means, and how, right, this space is racialized there. And we'll perhaps do that, at a time. But for the time being, I want to suggest that that these minds, were not permitted often enough to return to a meadow, and that this is in fact, the reason for the madness, right? And it's suggested in Ginsburg in various ways, although he has such a tendency to sort of romanticize all of these turnings of mind that it gets lost in a certain way, right? But it's certainly there in expressions like who were expelled from academies for crazy, and then even in references to publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, and what's interesting in that is like it turns towards this like kind of visionary metaphor, but it's like Blake in reverse, right? It's not to see eternity in an hour, but like the skull, right? It becomes this container, this cavern that, and it has windows, right? If the doors of perception, or the windows of the skull, the eyes, the perceiving out, right? But it's closed upon itself, right? And then the writing is like on the windows of the skull, like either the holes in the skull, or in the eyes, the openings, the apparatus of perception. And why publish there? Well, presumably because they're obscene and they couldn't be published elsewhere, right? They had to seek some place. And it seems to me that this is the dystopian version of the Robert Duncan poem in the beginning, that the howling and the madness and the staggering and the cowering and the burning and the it's interesting, There's a reference to Laredo in this poem too. I won't have time to discuss that, but it's interesting that this space is very much a space of the world, and in fact the movements through it are rather rapid. Like, right, he moves through Arkansas, Texas, he moves through New York, all within the course of a few lines, and I don't even believe there's a period to distinguish them entirely from one another. It's this long Whitman-esque incantation, and it's citational in a certain respect, right? And it's a citational, or we could say syntagm of all of these examples, right? Of being displaced from belonging, and it interests me, precisely because in its descriptive modality, it doesn't slow down, enough to actually take into account, how how these things, operate, And and what I wanted to do in the piece, that I was working with the Duncan poem, was cite an example of how these possibilities and permissions, right, are destroyed, and they're not necessarily destroyed by those parts of the normative social apparatus that one would most likely would be the most likely candidates to destroy them, right? They're certainly destroyed, by the police apparatus and by the FBI, and that Ginsburg cites, but they're also destroyed by ordinary liberal, well-intentioned, or maybe not so well-intentioned, good liberal academics, and and the problem is that when all of these refuges, right, or asylums of the pastoral meadow, whether that's literary or real, but these spaces that are inhabitable because one is permitted to return to them, right? But when all of these are closed to consciousness, that the inevitable result, right, is to hiccup endlessly, trying to giggle, and to find oneself in a space of withdrawal, but not a withdrawal that one chooses, but that is really imposed on one, right? And the seeking of company among the visionary Indian angels is also perhaps not so much a choice, but a last resort for consciousness to to attempt to find a means of holding on to a kind of possibility of belonging to either a space of imaginary return or supernatural ecstasy or whatever it might be. But Ginsburg certainly believes himself to be a political poet, and people will be angry at me for saying this, and I'm sure that that in many ways his work and his life, both within the writing and beyond the writing, do represent political engagement. However, he falls short of researching and finding the whys and ways of the means through which these things happen. And I don't know anything about Carl Solomon, but I can easily imagine that that the social spaces in which he resided were somewhat uncaring and perhaps draconian regarding the permissions with by the permissions by which he was either granted or denied poetic citizenship, perhaps other kinds of citizenship, and that, I think is extraordinarily important, work to do, even if it's extremely uncomfortable. Now the interesting thing about Ginsburg is that Ginsburg, kind of got to have his cake and eat it too. He got to be, an example of the censored, but ultimately, to be highly regarded, right, within the space of published poetry, and the second section of Howl, Moloch, all of the Molochs, and the jailhouses and the Congress, and it's a broad impressionistic or expressionistic painting that doesn't account for all of the subtleties of the ways that the way that not only that human bodies are displaced by apparatuses of suppression and oppression, but human consciousnces are displaced by these same apparatuses, and so in that third section, where he reiterates, right, again and again, I'm with you in Carl Solomon, I'm with you in Rockland, and I'm with you in Rockland, where you imitate the shade of my mother, and that's perhaps one of the most moving moments, because that's where certainly Ginsburg's closest and most personal understanding of this consciousness that was denied, right? Its meadow resides in the quote unquote madness, right, of his mother, and the intimacies of that relationship are in Kaddish are really moving, and I think in a certain way much more profound than what we see here in Howl, that is in a way this attempt to identify as a political subject with this space of extreme marginalization, but that doesn't really bear, right, the mechanisms, and hints at them in this form of this long reiteration of syntagmas of these scenes, right, from these desperate lives, but and perhaps that's important as a kind of inciting of consciousness, to action. But what's missing is the analysis in those periods of calm in daily and ordinary life, when we're in someone's office, and and we're being directed to Rockland, and but it might not at all be obvious, and I suppose that's why I'm interested in framing it in different terms, because the polite company of our poetries may mask and disguise, the hidden fascist national Golgotha that exists inside.